right, welcome back. Good to see you all still here. No slippage, that great word in the film industry, slippage, when dates seem to keep drifting by. Okay, AI's impact on the film value chain. Right, here's a quote from Jensen Huang, CEO of NVIDIA. That is how you say NVIDIA. It is not NVIDIA, it is NVIDIA. He has spent his entire life correcting people, so I might as well correct or make sure that you know how to say that word correctly. Okay. Jensen's an interesting character. Very interesting. Here's a quote about the new industrial revolution. NVIDIA, for those of you who may not know, is now the most valuable company in the world. Its value varies between about $3.4 and $4 trillion. It is the maker of uber super silicon chips. But that is not actually where it's got a market advantage. It is the software around those chips that give it market dominance. This is Jensen on the new industrial revolution a couple of weeks ago. We've entered the virtuous cycle of AI. Note the word virtuous. Virtuous signaling already, yeah? The AI ecosystem is scaling fast with more new foundation model makers, more AI startups across more industries and in more countries. AI is going everywhere, doing everything all at once. Almost Oscar winning. Yes. Not yet. This is the same man who said, AI will come for fiction writers first. This is the same man. He said this to Stephen Witt, very experienced journalist and author, award-winning author, who has written very recently a book called The Thinking Machine, where he had access to NVIDIA and to Jensen at length. It's a very interesting book. Me, as a deeply ungifted technical person, learned a lot from reading it. Any of you who really want to know what happens with chips and where they came from and how they've been developed and the software around them and the internecine warfare in Silicon Valley about who won this war, read The Thinking Machine. This concerns me. AI will come for fiction writers first. Read my lips. This is someone who's got sod all to do with Hollywood, sod all to do with scripts, directing, producing, making films and shows, writing books. But look at his pronouncement. It's quite confident, isn't it? It's alarming. It alarms me. Stephen, who is a very experienced, very good writer, wrote his book without using ChatGPT. And he was worried as he began to research NVIDIA and the rise and fast shooting star of AI that he would be out of a job as a non-fiction writer. Jensen said, no, you'll be all right for a bit longer. It's the fiction writers we'll get first. Look at the language that he's used. This is aggressive language. This is almost territorial. Yeah? These things get missed, by the way. Everyone misses this stuff, the nuances. The nuances are what makes us human. Yeah? When we pick up and we analyze things and we apply our critical mind to what is really being said, how it's being said, and what it might really mean. It's really interesting to me that fiction writers, ironically, are not necessarily at nearly as much risk as the paranoid beacons of so-called Hollywood hope have had it. And we'll come to why in a minute. This session, before lunch, is about transformation. Yeah? Like it or not. Yeah? It's about opportunities and hard boundaries. It matters because we have one short window to adapt to AI and shape the creative industries, making us fit for purpose. That is my mission statement, not the European Commission's. Value chains. Supplier, company, distribution, customer. Nice simple little model there for you. Why do value chains matter? Now, I describe them as a model, okay? They map key stages from an idea, a concept, all the way through to the market of that concept, product, reaching a market, okay? It's a critical framework. It was set up and, if you like, modeled, first of all, by Professor Michael Porter, a Harvard professor at the business school, back in 1985. Porter also then moved on to value chains and worlds and links, and he's also the author of the 5 key forces of competition, yeah? Peter Bloor, a colleague of mine, wrote a very interesting model and designed it for the film industry back in 2007 when I was starting to think about doing a PhD. And I found Peter's work really interesting, and a lot of his modeling on the film industry I adopted and adapted for my model on generative AI and the screen entertainment industries. Now, the reason why models are useful is because it gives you a chance to see the shape of things and to see where things are being applied and how over the sequence of a product going from idea to market. Let me give you an example, just to sort of bring this to life. When students at Cambridge go, yeah, we know about value chain models, I remind them actually that the most interesting, easy one to explain is, rather than diving straight into the complexity of the film industry model, is real estate, buildings. They have to be built on something, don't they? Is it sand? Is it water? Is it land out here? What is the underlying existing earth or foundations? Just as we talk about this, the idea and the script being the foundation for a film or a TV series, the land or the foundation, whatever you're building it on, is the starting point. Who then has the rights to that land? Who's allowed to exploit that land? In what terms? Have you licensed the land? Have you bought it out in perpetuity? And who's going to design what's going to be put on that land? The architects, the designers, yeah? The screenwriters, the writer-directors, the directors, yeah? And of course, how are you going to exploit it? Are you going to rent it out? Are you going to sell it all at the end? Are you going to slice and dice it into apartments? All part of the business model. Who is your audience? Who is your market? And do you start pre-selling them? Pre-selling apartments before they've been built. God, if only the film industry had pre-sales as healthy as real estate pre-sales for overpriced property and rent or acquisitions for apartments. We all know how difficult it is finding somewhere to live. Interesting, these models. So what we're going to cover today now is development, packaging, finance, production, and distribution. Okay? This is my simplification of the value chain. Now, in my work over the last 2 or 3 years, started to realize that AI is a bit like a skin. It's a skin that wraps itself around those different stages of the value chain. I don't mean that in any kind of sci-fi, highfalutin way. I just mean that actually it's really interesting when you realize that it is now, in terms of tools and usage and supportive mechanisms, is there at every stage. And that is what you'll find when you look at the book in detail, that with the encouragement of Cine Regio and the people who put up the finance to be able to help me research that book, you'll see that it really, really is like a worm tunneled into each of those stages of the value chain. Not all negative, I should just add. You may have thought I was being particularly tough this morning up until the break. Yeah, well, they deserve a good kicking, but the point is, let's see what we can learn. So we had this film value chain chart. What is really interesting is when you start to break it all down, I obviously mentioned that there's a lot of choice of tools, but there's different types of utility and supportive tools, or sometimes tools that might misdirect us, okay? So we go from development, the idea, yeah, of a concept, a story, and this is where I immediately trip up. Why do I trip up when I talk about AI, Gen AI, and ideas? Tell you why. Because it generates a shed load of ideas. In fact, Cornell University did sort of a study on this and said that humans come up with about 5 ideas every 15 minutes, and AI is capable of 200. Do we really want 200? Isn't that suddenly a smorgasbord that you can't even eat? How do we make the choice of what we actually intended to tell a story about when suddenly we're thrown all these options? That's not necessarily supportive or helpful. In fact, that's a distraction. Can you see immediately how what seems like a compelling, gosh, look at what AI can generate, is actually now a conundrum and not necessarily helpful because it could take you straight down a rabbit hole. Yeah? And most importantly, move you away from your very good idea that you wanted to explore in the first place. Was it supportive of that idea? Or are you now surrounded by multitudes of options? Yeah? That's just one example. The other examples in here, which are interesting, is around sales and marketing. I'm going to talk this morning about predictive models, predicting the future, predicting the outcomes of a film or a TV show. Yeah, let's see how AI gets on with that, okay? One of the things that really shocked me, and I should just warn you as an audience to be candid and transparent, I may be a very experienced executive producer who's put a lot of packages, worked with a lot of talent, worked on a lot of screenplays, put a lot of money together. I am useless when it comes to physical production. I'm the first to go, who's the line producer? I trust him or her. Who is actually on the set? Because I'm not often on the set. And I trust those post-production supervisors and the editor and the Foley artist and all those wonderful people who deal with the music and the ADR, etc. Because I am not that person who physically holds their hands at every minute as a hands-on producer. But of course, like I said at the very beginning this morning, we all learn through both failure, experience, exposure. And when I started to look at the tools for pre-production, production, and post-production, I was gobsmacked at how much is going on in terms of Gen AI tools and how some of those tools are genuinely really interesting and potentially supportive, yeah? When it comes to audiences and distribution, we will have an entire session this afternoon on algorithms, data, and where that's heading. And in fact, funny enough, when I woke up in my hotel this morning in Brussels, the Ankler newsletter came up. Now, how many of you know about the Ankler? Who subscribes to the Ankler? Very American, very USA, you know? Nobody here. Good, so I'm ahead of you. For once. What was really interesting is that Eric Barmack, who set up a newsletter called AI in Hollywood, which I wrote for a few times, is a former senior executive at Netflix, and he's taken the trouble to delve and dive deep into AI. And his really interesting article this morning was a deep dive into algorithms and data mining and how it's now beginning to become used by audiences to search for what they want to see. They're using Perplexity and ChatGPT and other types of large language models to research what they think they want to see. And what was astonishing about this is it's not the normal patterns that the algorithms have gone to find out about. They're across the dark web, the dirty web, everywhere in the web. And some of the results are extraordinary in terms of recommendation of content or what people think they want to see, rather than what we might see from our, what I would call normal media. Yeah? In other words, the algorithms are starting to dig up the dirt on the algorithms and refunnel it back into our choice-making processes. That is what I meant about the monster in need of a feed and it possibly eating its own tail. Yeah? What does dirty data really look like when it's suddenly data fed and created by algorithms about algorithms? I'm beginning to feel sort of 5 degrees of separation from what I actually intended to watch in the first place. So this is very much the framework of the book, Human in the Loop. This is a deep dive for 70% of that book, which looks at a huge number of tools. But we'll have a little canter through. This is a different kind of academic value chain chart, and this is where I started to build it right out. And if you imagine this value chain chart being 3 pages, not 1, that's where I came up with 100 tools. 100 tools. Spoilt for choice or confused. Yeah? This is the one that Charlotte, one of my editors, didn't like so much as the one before. She felt that was a little more digestible. I'm kind of with her, you know? But nevertheless, if you imagine that 3 times as big, that's what we're really dealing with as an image in terms of what's on offer and what's being pushed and sold to all of us. Yeah? So, in a way, this challenge around automation, there are 2 things to think about. The visible aspects and the invisible. Yeah? The on-screen public audience consumer outputs, the way that AI is collecting data, the way AI recommends viewing options, pushes models, and of course the invisible aspects, the things which are around behind the screen, the utility tools, the infrastructure, the workflows, some of the things which actually are extremely useful, as I have found out. Yeah? So, in a way, when we're thinking about these, it's very useful to think about the visible and the invisible. Yeah? It's a really useful framework when you look at that value chain because it gives you a chance to be able to think, okay, so what is actually publicly out there, what's pushing what we see, and where my content or film or TV show or documentary or animation might go, and how will it get there to the intended audience, yeah, in comparison to some of the tools behind the screen that help to actually get made, yeah? This is very important to have both dimensions within, however, a responsible, transparent, ethical framework. So here we go. Look at what's going on because it's really busy. Look at all of that. Gosh, scripts, dialogue, story plots. Gen AI have lots of applications there. Ideas, packaging, and pitching materials. Automatic completion of code, gaming programs, etc. Task models, budgets, schedules, locations, Super Scout. Super Scout. Anyone use Super Scout yet? No. You've got that joy to look forward to. Okay. Early market research and targeting, so-called predictive models, which I'll come to. 3D assets and artwork generation for screen content. Voice generation and dubbing for so-called, and I hate this word, foreign language. Wait, what's foreign about speaking your own tongue? Yeah? Since when did the Americans have such extraordinary hegemony over foreign language? I much prefer the word, not even art house, but I always think when I go to Berlin, to the European film market, of world cinema. Sounds just so much better, doesn't it? Sort of more inclusive and dynamic and larger than foreign language. You know? Like it's sort of over here in a ghetto. We're not supposed to talk about it, really, because it's for cineasts and arty people. And it's got that word culture. Culture, oh no, another war, you know? Jeez. Very interesting about synthetic actors. Let's talk about Tilly. Extras, big issue around SAG-AFTRA in terms of extras and the rights and the performance rights that the studios and so-called producers wanted to take away from actors in terms of AI generation. Performance rights issues, song lyrics, oh my God, don't even get me started about the music industry. Yes, that is ripe for all sorts of massive disruption at the moment that we've seen. But of course, there's AI music inputs now in terms of film and TV. Animation, one of the whole chapters in Human in the Loop is about animation. And do you remember when I was talking about those craft skills? That is seriously under threat in terms of animation across the board. That is a big issue, yeah? And of course, algorithms applied across the value chain, push models. But who's actually driving adoption across the value chain? Talent. And I include producers. Producers are also talent, actually. We tend to have a sort of rather schizophrenic view of producers in Europe, on the continent, and in the UK to some extent. The BFI looks down on producers if they're sort of somewhat grubby and commercial. In fact, they're the project managers who start, produce, and stay to the very end forever on a film project. Yeah? They are critical. They are the project managers. Yeah? Talk about responsibility. A director may spend a year of their life on a film. A producer may well spend 25 years looking after a film. It's a big responsibility. Yeah? Okay? But very important, when I say who's driving adoption, Who's making decisions about which tools to use? Yeah? Who is promoting the prompt? Who is suggesting that these are the tools that we should be using? Because right now, when I used that term before, jagged frontier, it's incredibly fragmented and uneven. On each film set or TV show, there's an enormous amount of mixed range of knowledge, ability, and desire to apply the tools or not. In fact, it's very disorganized. Yeah? And perhaps that's not a bad thing that it is disorganized at the moment, rather than flattened out across everything and is ubiquitous everywhere. Yeah? And here we go on the hype cycle. The hype cycle, we have had a large dose of. Yeah? Big dose. AI is here, whether you like it or not. It's the new big shiny thing. Everyone needs to start using it. You'll be left behind if you don't use it. Yeah? Etc., etc. It's not that you're going to lose your job. It's going to be someone else who knows about AI who will take your job. We've heard all of these memes and talk. Yeah? All of this requires human oversight. But not just that. When we're talking right now, today, about AI, you probably picked up this morning that it's in the balance. It could be heading for a bubble, a big bubble, which might burst. What they're desperately concerned about is that, in fact, this room is multiplied by the other 1 billion users at the moment of Gen AI tools around the world who are using them ad hoc, sporadically, often using them at their workplace without permission from the workplace. The workplace hasn't got any kind of structural rules and hasn't trained anybody. And yet no one actually wants to put their hand up and say, yeah, that piece was generated with a bit of AI. Oh no, I actually don't want to say that. I don't want my bosses to know that I managed to speed up my workflow by using ChatGPT. So let's just keep it under the table. Well, now you've been using a tool inside a workplace which might have threatened the company's privacy, its data, etc. You can see that we're still in the Wild West. 3 years in, the Wild West. No proper frameworks. Lots of business leaders who are my age, or perhaps a little younger, who are scared because they don't actually understand the technology. They don't understand, they kind of feel drawn to the idea that they ought to know about it, and they've got FOMO, fear of missing out, but they have no idea how to implement this. At the same time, they hear lots of risks around implementation, privacy, data, copyright, etc. You can't actually generate under the rules, especially in America, anything that's AI generated does not actually inherently have copyright. Oh, well, actually, we can't do what we thought we could do, which is to get all the AI gen tools to write the first draft and then get the writers to polish, which, by the way, is a quote from a producer a little later on in Los Angeles 2 years ago. So, development, where it all starts. Concepts, worlds, universes, storylines. When I've talked to writers about this, some of them have said, yeah, I've played around with it. Yeah, it's been kind of interesting. It's a bit like sort of shining a torch in the woods, you know? And sometimes the torch lands on an interesting new tree that you hadn't thought about or hadn't looked at carefully. But ultimately, in the end, there's an awful lot of trees inside that generative model of ideas. And ultimately, it's up to the writer or writers to make the choices of where they want to go. Yeah? So it might be a useful torch shining around, but it does not make up for the fact that we need to make decisions on what we value and what we want to tell and what we want to explore. Yeah? So that's very important from that point of view. So it can be supportive, but you know, we were also told for quite a while that AI was going to be writing quite soon an Oscar-winning screenplay. And we're still waiting. And in fact, if any of you have read anything generically written by AI that's supposedly fictional, then I would argue that Jensen at NVIDIA is wrong. See, I'm arguing with the richest man in the world. Well, never mind. Bring it on. It's wrong because of everything that I covered this morning about the human condition, about our quest and desire for understanding, about ourselves, about the world that we live in, about how we work, how we value, how we feel, how we love, how we hate, and why we hate. Yeah? Everything I've just said is not in a large language model's lexicon other than what it is straight that has already gone before. Yeah? In other words, it's looking for patterns, as I said, rather than actually being able to live and breathe that experience as a writer does when they apply their craft to writing a screenplay. Yeah? Doesn't mean to say that some of the things that I've come across, like script editing programs, can be incredibly helpful. Yeah? Now, this is always tricky. No writer loves a script editor. No writer loves getting a report from a script editor, so very often a producer will not give the report written by the script editor to the writer. They will interpret it, and they might have a conversation or a coffee, yeah? But they very rarely will actually press send. Pretty wise. Writers have a habit of looking at all the bad stuff and ignoring all the good stuff and going, what are you on about? You clearly haven't read the script properly. If I change this, it'll impact on that. You're not really close to the material. You haven't understood where I'm heading. Can you imagine what it's like for a screenwriter to get an AI-generated report? We're now about 10 times worse in terms of creative management values. You've now succeeded in alienating your writer, perhaps for life, rather than just for a day or two. You're in trouble. This is all what I call the art of creative management. Looking after, guiding, supporting, and helping the people that you work with who are at the coalface of creativity. Yeah? Press send on an AI-generated script report and you're in trouble. So there are tools and interesting ones, but there is no creative origination. There is no imagination. It's seductive, but remember what I said about nuance? It's lacking in nuance. Doesn't have human values and characteristics, doesn't understand necessarily emotional drivers other than the mimicry of what it's learned from its scraping and training. Sorry, training, not scraping. Scraping sounds bad, doesn't it? Yes, well, it is bad. Yeah, exactly. Supportive, but not directive. So this is a quote from the LA producer who sat down with me at the American film market and told me blithely, I think it was 2023 or 22, what's great is we can get AI to write the first draft and get writers to polish. It'll save so much time and money. We're in trouble. If that's what they think, we're really in trouble, aren't we? What about packaging? Now, this is when I talked about augmentation and producers actually having a new world. It costs a lot of money to make a proof of concept sizzle or even a short version of what you're trying to make. Yeah? That kind of stuff costs thousands of euros. Yeah? When you're able to actually pre-visualize and come up with sizzles, mood reels, what we call the proof of concept work as a producer, you are now armed with a lot more tools. However, having looked and worked on these tools myself as a producer, what worries me is there's a sameness to them. The lighting looks a little bit familiar. There's a sort of flatness. The colorization is all a little bit similar. Yeah? And you look at the images, even when we were joking and not joking about the uncanny valley and getting out the other side, there's something slightly unreal about the machines that have generated these images. You need to be super careful as a curator of your own work, as a producer, to know how best to use AI in terms of generating decks and materials and Bibles and proof of concept sizzles. Because if you don't apply that critical eye, you are now adding to a pile of what looks like more of the same. That is a serious problem for you as a producer, never mind about our industry. More of the same is not good enough. Go back to Pepper. More is not good, only good is good. Quality control is critical. And it starts there with that producer generating materials, possibly with the writer and director, certainly with the team, certainly with the company. But the quality of these goods may be very seductive to do them cheaper, but is cheaper actually cheapening the project? Is it conveying your real intentions? And this is all about intentions at this point of the value chain. What are you intending to make that you are passionate about, that you care about, and you want to explore and share with other people and ultimately reach an audience. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is have some impact. Yeah? No producer in all the hundreds of hours of training that I've done all over the world has ever, apart from one poor schmuck, put their hand up and said, I want to make loads of money. They've all said, I want to make impact. I want my stories to count. I want them to change people's lives. That is where the hands go up. Not, I want to get rich. Yeah? Some of you are laughing with a certain amount of self-reflection and self-knowledge. Yeah, totally. Storyboarding. Barmack in the Anklet writes quite elegantly about the means of access to tools that help a director, a writer-director, a producer when it comes to storyboarding. It is absolutely true that you don't necessarily have to spend some few thousand euros. You can actually work with some of the very interesting tools and move through that process much more swiftly. This is where the utility can have value, absolutely. Positioning. This is where some of the tools like Cinelytic and Largo AI, a Swiss company who's been in the AI training and development packaging business for quite a while, is really interesting because we get into this problem of, can they really tell the future? And we'll come back to that in a minute. What are the risks of all this in packaging and pitching? What are the risks of this augmented approach? Homogenized imagery, flat, task-orientated, rather than critical analysis. And something else that I've noticed. You know what? It's interesting when big machines are trained by huge volumes of data, there's a little thing going on called risk aversion. They don't want to put their head too far up the parapet. Everything comes down a little notch. Is that what you really want? Is that what you intended when you wanted to come out with your really extraordinary, gifted, talented, visual support of your project? That stunning 90-second sizzle, yeah? Flat and more of the same, it doesn't look quite believable. Can you see how critical we need to be as filmmakers about what we share, especially early on in the process, because that is our field of dreams, yeah? And we need to be super critical, not go, oh, well, it cost less. Well, that was the price of fish. It cost less and it looks shit. So it's not going to get funded anyway, right? So some self-criticism is really, really important here. Cinelytic, let's have a look at that. It offers coverage. So you can plug your script into Cinelytic and it'll give you a 5-page coverage report, which will tell you what its intended audience was. It'll give you a synopsis. It'll give you a character profile breakdown. It'll give you a note on the dialogue, all the things that I used to do for film studios when I was a young person in my 20s, when I read hundreds of scripts for people like Nordis Film Studios and Pandora in France. That's how I learned, with a little small language model. Yeah, small is beautiful. It'll give you comparison titles. Well, let's have a think about comps, because comps are interesting, aren't they? Things that have gone before, because actually there's a little bit about the film industry in particular, not necessarily the same as the television industry, which of course has for a long time been a monster in need of a feed, which has been around scheduling, whereas we make films and we're not quite sure who's going to show up. So we're going into the abyss. Yeah. But what's interesting about comps is that if you look at the most recent research about what AI values in terms of comps, it does not value any actor who's younger than 40. Literally. Doesn't count. Doesn't rate them. Ignores them. Thinks that they're completely irrelevant to any audience. I kid you not. If you're Tom Cruise, you're fine. Tom Hanks, super. Julia Roberts, fine. If you're anybody younger than 40, it's thumbs down. What help is that when it comes to comps? Yeah? So you can see when we talk about bias, yeah, when we talk about where the data's coming from, we can see how actually corrosive that might become when we start to rely on these tools for our positioning of content, when in fact it's not doing the job that it's going to serve us accurately, well, or convincingly to any third party. Casting recommendations, same as comps. Now we're in the casting recommendation problem. Yeah? it's got age bias. Tricky. And I mean this because it's very carefully researched. One of the things that has been really interesting is commissioning targets. Being able to adapt and adjust your pitch to RTVE in Spain, or to ZTF in Germany, or to A24 in the US. As if there's sort of a magic potion that you plug in and it just tells you, if you change this and this, it'll be fine for A24. I haven't seen any more commissioning happening because of this, because there's only a certain level of commissioning that's actually getting done anyway. So it's not like anything has suddenly leapt into being more, Distribution strategies. I have tested it on distribution strategies, but it hasn't told me anything particularly that I didn't know already. And perhaps one of the more useful things is edits, suggested edits against a budget, when it's able to analyze a schedule, an above and the below line budget next to the script. This is where some of its data crunching is useful. Sometimes it can come up with answers that we might not have come up with. One of the great examples I had of a human doing this very effectively was my former colleague Ian Canning, who's now the CEO of Seesaw, when he made The King's Speech as the lead producer. They had a problem with The King's Speech. They had an enormous scene towards the end of the film. It was a huge royal family scene outside Buckingham Palace, all the usual stuff that the Americans love, and the Brits keep giving them, la, la, la. Anyway, what was interesting is that Ian was told by the financiers that they had to cut a significant sum off the budget. And instead of doing what we call salami slicing through every head of department, where you cut them 5%, because he was so close to the material, he knew that scene towards the end of the film was not an establishing scene, when often in independent movies we make it big at the front and then we're back in a little room, because of course the budget was pretty tight, we didn't have a lot to play with, but we made it big at the beginning to give everyone a sense that there was an establishing sort of value to this film. What Ian realized was that scene had nothing to do with the narrative, that it didn't actually matter emotionally or in terms of the logic of the characters. It was just a big scene. And that was what got cut by Ian and got them to the point of greenlighting The King's Speech at $13 million. The rest, of course, is history. It took $415 million worldwide box office, etc., and set up Seesaw for life. AI could have done exactly the same thing. What I'd love to do is to get Ian to test and see whether or not it came up with the same solution if you plugged it in. That would be a good, really interesting bit of modeling. But what I am saying is that there are places where AI can be fit for purpose, and there are other places where you need to be much more cautious. Tony Grisoni, wonderful writer, wonderful character. Worked with him, with Terry Gilliam, for 2 or 3 years on Good Omens, which we failed to get financed as a feature film. I was told by Fox, when it used to be a studio, one more studio gone down. They said, Angus, it's a really interesting script, but it's $1 million on every page. Or for every page. Tony was the co-writer with Terry Gilliam. I talked to Tony a while back about Gen AI. He's a vastly experienced screenwriter, both in TV and in film. And he said, the best tools are systemized, consistent, and data point driven, which is an enormous improvement on much feedback I get from development executives whose notes can be vague, self-serving, prescriptive, and incorporating the latest half-assed development course or book they've done. What's really interesting, and I think where Tony is heading with this, and I am guilty of it myself as a writer. I have written screenplays, and I'm in the middle of a screenplay at the moment. What's really interesting is that we think we know what we've written, but we don't. Or we have what I call selective memory, or selective perception. And when you put your script through a data point of how many pages it was since X character and then reappearing at Y, you thought it was only about 8 or 9 pages, and you found it was 21, and we'd forgotten about them. So what I'm saying is sometimes, if in the blend of feedback and in the blend of the team who are developing, you use some of these tools, they can be really useful if applied consistently and carefully, and everyone is on the same page about the fact that you're using them. So there are areas which can be really positive. AI is a creative partner. There are boundaries. Remember what I said? no copyright in generative AI materials and writing. And that was enshrined and reminded to everyone in the WGA settlement, but of course it was copied by other writing guilds around the world and equity, etc. Be very careful what I said about distractions, going down the AI rabbit hole. And it was actually 130,000 Charlotte, not 160 scraped. That's the right number. Sorry, I got ahead of myself by 30,000 scripts. Yeah, that's what was scraped, by the way, in the biggest scrape of Hollywood screenplays ever. Yeah. So back to the craft skills, the art of craft skills, life experience, emotions, and judgment. That word intentions is so important. What do we intend? What is our purpose? What is it that excites us about a story that we want to be able to relay and communicate to a lot of other people? Yeah? And do those tools really help you realize those intentions? Do you remember this great quote? Nobody knows anything. Adventures in the Screen Trade. Yeah? William Goldman, Oscar-winning writer. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Yeah? Wonderful screenwriter. What he meant by nobody knows anything, which has often been quoted out of context, is no one knows what's going to be a hit until it hits. That's what he meant. What did he really mean? I've answered that. But we're told that there are a range of predictive tools. I said I'd come on to prediction, and now we're here. All right. AI tools love the idea that they can give you projections. They can give you return on investment. Yeah? Performance indicators. They're all over KPIs, as you can imagine. Although I might remind you that Deloitte was recently fined millions of dollars for misusing Gen AI on a certain level of consulting because it didn't know what it was doing, which reminds us also that we should not trust the consultants when it comes to AI. Remember that. Yeah. The alleged de-risking. We can de-risk this for you. Yeah? We can make your decision-making enter a safer space. Yeah? Modeling. They love models. Not just KPIs, key performance indicators, but they love models and market indicators. There's a load of tools out there for this, especially Kalia, yeah, but also Script Sense, etc. And all these tools are linked in the book, so you can go and play with them and find out about them. And yet, I wanted to test this. And this is very relevant to us today in this amazing building, which I described to one of my colleagues as a brutalist building. Protagonist was the sales company that sold the Brutalist all around the world. And here we are in a Brutalist building. George, the managing director of Protagonist, and I and his CEO, Dave Bishop, had a drink about 6 weeks ago. And I said, guys, I really need to understand. You've had years of experience of running sales estimates. You've had all sorts of different types of projects. Surely you've been really, really playing around with Gen AI and trying to work out what it can do for you in terms of your sales estimates. Here's the answer. We've worked in detail and depth with Gen AI predictive tools, and their sales projections are always off. Always off. Not just a little bit off. Off. Yeah? Unreliable. Either too rosy or too negative, but they're never on the money. Now, what does that mean? What's really interesting is that this business of gut instinct, judgment, experience, being at the coalface of the actual film market and listening to real people who are buyers and what they say about the market and what they're looking for. Yeah? Not taking what has been in the press or what's available online, but actually listening to your buyers in person. Yeah? Humans doing business with humans. Yeah? To me, having run a sales company for 6 years, amongst other things, and having ran the production finance market in London for 10 years, where we curated 60 producers and 60 financiers together, I was basically a glorified pimp, organizing their meetings for 15, 20 minutes. So, nice job if you can get it. The point I'm getting at is all of that communication and sharing of information is incredibly enlightening and important in a way that predictive modeling based on past numbers that it can get hold of is never going to be the same. I was in Malta in June at the Mediterranean Film Festival, and I went to one of the gaming industry talks. And they had a professor from one of the European universities, very slick guy, very, very smart, who stood up and gave this very buzzy presentation about Gen AI for startup companies. He said, gut instinct is over. Leave it to Gen AI, it will do all the work. And right at the end of the talk, after this very, very powerful, beautifully presented justification of how wonderful it was at modeling, he said, but of course you have to remember that humans do have a role. Thanks, we've got a role. Gut instinct is actually what makes up a lot of our decision making. It isn't necessarily rational. Sometimes it's a feeling. Sometimes it is exactly that. It's a gut instinct. Sometimes it's nature that tells us this is special. This is worth getting out of bed for. This has got something that I can't put my finger on, but I can feel it. Everything I've just said has got nothing to do with Gen AI machines and a lot to do with the way that we do make decisions about unique, compelling, special stories. Yeah? So listen to the experts. I talked about the fact that it's not a fortune teller, that historical data and prior patterns and what has gone before does not necessarily give us what's next. Yeah? Taste, nuance, and risk-taking. Now let's put this in context. We want not to just be able to make films and stories today, but we want our sons, daughters, and the next generation to make films of tomorrow. If everything is reduced to what has gone before, they haven't arrived yet, so an algorithm will never greenlight them by definition. Well, we don't know those actors, we don't know that writer-director, we don't know that producer, therefore our indication in terms of our predictive model is 0. Where are people going to get a shot to learn their craft, to make their mistakes, to make their first film outside a very stretched, impoverished, managing poverty, public sector of agencies who are withering in terms of support? So this notion that we can work the data and rely on a predictive model leaves out the future, actually, if you think about it. That's a huge problem that no one seems to be talking about. That's a huge issue. If I was running a public agency, I would be really concerned about over-reliance on anything to do with predictive data, because I want to be there for the next generation. I want to be taking what's called risk, because we are in the risk business. In fact, that is essentially what helps define us. That is a positive thing. Without risk, we won't tell compelling, fresh, original stories for tomorrow. And we certainly won't at this rate if we're just jacking backwards, and not supporting the next generation. It doesn't matter how old we are, but we need to be in that mindset, that growth mindset that is so important to be able to support the storytellers of tomorrow and the future. Because it's a people business. Never mind what the 5 horsemen say, it is all about being a people business still. You go to Cannes, you go to Berlin, you go to lots and lots of different festivals. There's an enormous reason why those events still happen, because we talk to each other, we meet each other, we exchange information. We enjoy, most of the time, meeting each other again. Yeah? Most of the time. Yeah. Garbage in, garbage out, I said. Quality of your data inputs, judgment and weight, incredibly important. Look at all these films out of the independent sector. Most of them obviously are English language, but they're interesting just by definition of example, okay? Anora. Who's seen Anora? Did you like Anora? Yeah, quite a special film, huh? Yeah, quite touching. Can you imagine the cast of Anora being marked by a Gen AI? Very young. Can you imagine the subject? Prostitution, nudity, Russian drug addict, stroke, rich, entitled guy. Still think we're in the, no, we're not going anywhere with Gen AI, I don't think. Yeah? Moonlight. Wonderful, beautiful coming-of-age gay story made for about $1.5 million, which won the Oscar. Don't think Gen AI is going to be anywhere. Parasite. An upstairs-downstairs movie. Wonderful film. Who's seen Parasite? Yay, there you go. See? These films came not from nowhere, but they came from authentic voices, they came from storytellers, they came from passion, they came from people who had something to say. Do you honestly think that Netflix knew that Squid Game was going to be a massive worldwide hit? Do you know what Netflix said about Squid Game? We thought it might do well in South Korea, because, you know, they all know the game, because they played it as kids. We thought it might travel a little bit to Southeast Asia, maybe Far East Asia. We didn't see the world coming. No algorithm told them that Squid Game was going to be a worldwide hit, yeah? Right? The Queen's Gambit, one of my favorite TV series, which took years, 15, 20 years to get off the ground. Chess, it's about chess. Oh no, not chess. It's like watching paint dry, isn't it? You know? Well, female, who's drinking all the time. She's got a drug addict problem because she's got alcohol problems and hallucinates on the ceiling about which position is the chess. Yeah, no. There's no way we're doing that. You know? Can't imagine it. You see what I mean? It's interesting, isn't it? Adolescence, the most recent one. Do you know what got that movie made? Brad Pitt and Dee Gardner. Because Mark Herbert at Warp was on his last legs trying to develop and package that show. It was only when Plan B got involved that Netflix said, okay, if you really insist. Literally, I tell you, oh well, we'll roll the dice. The algorithm, no. But Brad, anything for you. There you go. These are just examples, but it's so interesting, isn't it? Because consensus by model kills innovation. Yeah? Pre-production, virtual production planning, workflow tools. This is where it gets interesting. Scheduling and budgeting, things where there are data points which are empirical, can be adjusted and have an impact, and a causal relationship to each other. We all know, all of us, the importance of the script being of a timely manner to be reflected in a up-to-the-date schedule. It's no good having a schedule done from script 6 when you're now on script 12. Yeah? Even I know that as an executive producer. AI is very good at picking up all of those things, and as I pointed out, location sits extraordinary. Super Scout is an incredibly smart operation that also has bedded into it some proper environmental concerns. Yeah? It is actually fit for purpose. It has thought about the environment. It has thought about, generation of energy consumption. Yeah? So there are clever people out there who are using these tools in a clever, smart, supportive way. The thing that makes me worry is the synthetic voice casting. In fact, the word synthetic starts to make me worry. Yeah? I think immediately of slop rather than an aura or the Queen's Gambit. Yeah? Some of these tools are fairly interesting to use. Some of them, like Unreal Engine, and they don't tell you this, are really fucking hard work. Oh my God, it does my brain in. It's really difficult to use. You need to get trained to use Unreal Engine properly on Unreal Engine. It is not at all intuitive. Yeah? So there are some tools that we can really dig in and actually learn and do ourselves, and some that really do need heavy lifting. Okay? So who's actually being impacted by all of this so far across the value chain? Producers, of course, they're being impacted. Are they being trained? Not a lot. In fact, very little. Are line producers being trained? Not a lot. Location managers, first ADs, heads of departments, directors are the bit that really worry me, because already in post-production they're expected to know an awful lot about CGI, special effects, all sorts of things that they're supposed to be up to clue with. A lot of them fake it, hoping they'll make it. Fair enough, it's really difficult. There might be a writer-director who's come from a different background who's not even engaged with physical production and post. Understand. But now they've got a whole other set of pressures on them in terms of this array of tools and options. Not easy. Upskilling is critical. Do I see upskilling being talked about in terms of, let's just say, even across the European, Creative Europe, EU space? Not a lot. I see reports by the British Film Institute, who will kill me if I say this, so I'll say it anyway, might as well, who publish reports like AI in the screen industry, pathways forwards, and suggest and recommend training, but I haven't actually seen any impact from that yet. It's great to talk about it. Who's doing it? Yeah? Look at all of you when I asked who's been actually formally trained on any tools. A smattering. Yeah? Principal photography. The trend outside Catherine Bigelow, James Cameron, and a bunch of other high-end, top Hollywood people is moving towards what I call synthetic production. Virtual means and ways of real-time rendering, large action models, volumetric capture, replacing physical assets. Soon there won't be location commissions where you have to go and see someone about shooting in Flanders. There'll just be a whole load of data and a whole load of library material. And then unless you're actually going to pay to be there on set, shooting in live, everyone will be starting to license you imagery, large action imagery. This is coming already, yeah? Digital twin assets, voice swaps, synthetic actors like Tilly. Let's not forget about Tilly. Yeah. Weather, lighting simulations, all of these things. There's a host of tools out here. And even NVIDIA has been starting to get in on the rat race of tool generation for some of these properties. Yeah? So, what do you really want to achieve? How does the synthetic process support rather than undermine your intentions? I talked about the obsession with realism. Some of the most interesting, wonderful artistic work that communicates well with us has got nothing to do with realism. If you think about Pixar, let's just take Pixar for example. Do you remember, if you cast your minds way back to Monsters, Inc.? Monsters, Inc. And remember Sully, the big blue monster, who had loads and loads of hair on his back? And little Bo, the little girl that was best friends with Sully, yeah? Do you know that Pixar drew 2 million strands of blue hair on the back of Sully? Why did they do that? Why did they go to so much trouble to make Sully so hairy and furry? One was so that we would trust and believe that little Bo could cling off his back, and she'd sort of hang around his neck, and there was enough fur on the back of his neck for her to cling safely. Yeah? That wasn't very important. And the other was basically about the fact that he could be a lovable, soft, cuddly toy rather than not necessarily a monster, which of course he also did rather well. When I asked Pixar about this, we were talking about believable. We're not talking about realistic. We're talking about being in a moment which we believe. So this obsession with realism is actually not the point. What it's doing is pandering to what AI can supposedly give you an output for, not necessarily the effect that we want to achieve when we're telling stories. Yeah? So, is everyone on the same page? This problem of jagged frontier. According to my research and my work in the industry, no. Directors are sometimes being left behind or playing catch up, and I have a high degree of sympathy for them. This is a fast-moving train. They've got enough on their plate when it comes to trying to hold a story in their head, to be able to work with multiple different talent and crew, to be under the pressure of time. And by the way, they are still under pressure for time. Let AI kid you not. Yeah? Okay? Everything everywhere is moving so fast, isn't it? According to Jensen, my point about speed. Films have a rhythm. There's a rhythm that's like an alchemy between the different heads of departments, the director and the producer and the writer and the actors. There's an alchemy. They have to move at a certain pace for what is right for that film. that project, not be speeded up and shunted like a railway carriage out here. Yeah? This is very, very important. Decision-making systems get under pressure. What if you're editing in real time while the whole thing is being shot? Yeah? Well, that means the director's probably not able to see everything that the editor is doing because it's already happened. It's already gone. Yeah? This is sounding like a factory, an industrial factory. I can understand why cheap melodrama, sort of 20-minute, or what we're now calling microdramas. Yeah? Well, you can just see AI licking its lips at microdrama, can't you? Oh, yeah, let me at them. Great. Yeah? Built by the quickest machine. Yeah? But my point is that when we talk about those quality films and that high desire to actually go and see or at least watch high quality content, that actually is not going to happen here. Not very often. Yeah? In other words, what is best for the creative process? Each filmmaker has their own rhythm. Yeah? So, who's auditing this? Who's checking on what's happening? What quality control is out here? Yeah? These are very important. Post. Now, the truth is, even I, as a neo-Luddite, understand that Post has been working with quite high-end tech for quite a while. You can go back 25, 30 years, and they have been on the cutting edge of all sorts of different types of digital advances, CGI, VFX, etc., etc. Quite extraordinary, and I have a huge amount of respect for people who work in it, who get their hands dirty with it, who really understand it. But they have also been hit by an avalanche of new tools. Massive, probably more tools in post than anywhere else, yeah? Automated editing, dubbing, blah, 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 tools for audio, multilingual skinning, grading, VFX is being upgraded by AI all the time, etc., etc., etc. Vubbing, the idea that you can change someone's lips to get the right tone and language, etc., or even a different performance, if you so wish. There's a lot going on, yeah? Who has eyes on all this? Who's over all the outputs, yeah? Who is your quality controller? When you deliver a film to an end user, whether it's a sales company or a distributor or a studio or a streamer, there's a lot of exacting work that has to go into both the technical, the legal, and of course the creative, to be able to effect delivery. Those of you who are producers will know how agonizing and stressful actual delivery of a film or a TV show is. If this is all happening very fast, and you're in a synthetic, one-size-fits-all, let's hurry up because it's going to save money, what are you also skimping on? What are you getting wrong at the same time? What isn't actually happening? Yeah? Who's on it? Who's really on it in terms of the outputs? So, what does the post-production sector think and feel? Jeremy Thomas, who's made nearly 100 films, who's been across post on all his films, said we all have to adapt or die. It's here, just got to get on with it. Very pragmatic for someone who is in his mid-70s. This is a man who won 6 Oscars, I think it was, for The Last Emperor, who's directed films, who is a titan of cinema, yeah? He's aware that you can't buck the fact that trains are coming down the railway line because they're going to come whether we like it or not. In post, I've noticed that there's a demographic sort of atrophy for the post-50-year-olds who are saying, oh my God, another whole load of things to learn. Jesus, I'm tired. Do we really have to learn all of this now as well with this whole new layer of skin? Ugh, you know? It's a bit like that moment, you know, when Javier Bardem finally catches up with Daniel Craig in Skyfall. What is this running around, James? It's exhausting. I'm exhausted, you know? That's how they feel, you know? But there is also genuine sadness at the loss of certain creative skills. If any of you have sat and worked with a Foley artist, oh my word, oh gosh, the depth and sensitivity of their skills, the breadth of imagination of what they use to create sound and moments of sound and fragments of sound is extraordinary. This is all being sound brushed out by AI, yeah? These are highly skilled creative technicians, yeah? And just the thought of those artists, and there's a reason why they're called artists, being lost is actually a real loss, tangible to the industry, yeah? On the other hand, to be fair and balanced, not that I've ever worked for the BBC, and they have a tricky track record at the moment of balance, just ask Trump. What I love about Gen AI, and this is a top UK post-production supervisor, is the ability to test and find out what is in the director's head within minutes, not days and thousands of pounds. Justin was making a really interesting point here. He's saying that what you can actually do in terms of rendering and getting a scene or a moment or an effect into a state very quickly that is very recognizable with Gen AI tools at a very, very cheap, much quicker level than spending weeks, days, weeks, months on certain types of frames is extraordinary. In other words, Justin's trying to think about how can I test, see whether or not this works. Is this input going to be a good output for the director? That is, of course, assuming that the director knows what's going on in his or her head. But let's just give them the benefit of the doubt, yeah? But I find that quote really interesting because I think this is, again, where AI can be supportive, yeah? And the tool's genuinely helpful if they're applied in a smart, measured, strategic way, and you bring the team together. So the AI is not an outlier, but something that also the director has been explained, trained, and understands that this is why they're able to see something so much quicker. By the way, we can adjust, we can move this around, the color and the coding and the light, etc., can move. But is this what you were thinking? Within minutes, not days, within very little money in comparison to thousands of dollars? That's interesting, yeah? Pixar. Okay, so in my work at Cambridge, I asked the number 2 at Pixar to give what we call a coach night for the MBA students at Cambridge a couple of years ago. And she said, you really need to think about what Pete Docter, the studio head at Pixar, has to say about AI. And I'm going to quote, you see these demos and it looks like, oh my gosh, AI can do anything. It's a magic box. But when you dig a little deeper, it's pretty problematic just getting consistency. My experience with it is if I've got any vision at all of what I want in my head, it's a disaster. The key clue to that quote is consistency, yeah? Matching what is inside a director's head to the actual intended output, not the bastard child, yeah? To me, this is really interesting because this business about consistency is something that a lot of post-production supervisors and animation experts and people who work across animation say, yes, but it's always getting better. Gen AI is improving. Well, it can keep improving, but the question is, does it match what the director intends? It's not how good it is or realistic it is. It's matching it. It's the process of us, back to us in the loop, the humans, making sure it's doing what we intend. What should AI do, not what can it do? Yeah? Marketing and distribution, getting towards the end of that value chain. Planning, marketing, positioning, dominated by predictive analysis. Everything's okay because you're not going to lose any money. I don't hear them actually saying that so much about the film industry, though, because Hollywood is probably going through one of its worst periods ever. Once there were 7 studios, then there were 6. Now there are soon to be 4 studios. Never mind about just fires, bonfires. In Hollywood, there's all sorts of things going on. Industrial strikes, runaway production, go to LA and it costs you $100 to buy a flat white. Well, nearly. Yeah, that's my predictive model for the next year. Yeah, you know what I mean, though. We talked a lot in the industry over the last 30 years about the need for more research. When I wrote The State of European Cinema in 1993 for the European Film Academy, and then wrote it as a proper textbook in 96. And I said to you at the beginning of today, Europe was in trouble, had a very low cinema share at box office compared to Hollywood. Everyone at that point said, we need more research. Producers are clueless. They don't know where the audience is. Yeah? I'm not against research at all, given that I am a researcher. Absolutely. But the tricky thing is that even with research, we can be selective. We suffer from a lot of different types of bias. We have recency bias, where we think the most recent examples are more important than ones that happened perhaps a little bit earlier. We have all sorts of different types of bias around who we like, or we favor, or we've worked with before, than people who are fresh and new that we haven't worked with before. There is a whole range of different types of cognitive bias that we apply. Guess what? We've trained all the AI machines on us, on our material, on the internet over the last 25, 30 years. They suffer from a lot of our biases. Of course they do. They're replicating, yeah, like reptiles, our biases. Yeah, look at what I said to you about their selection of younger actors as being worthless and meaningless, and that only actors over 40 are important. So research and comps, things that have gone before, have an input, they have some value, but they need to be part of a mix. Yeah? Very important. Campaign timing. That's an interesting one. We all know that even in a very difficult independent market, distributors are buying probably normally 12 to 18 months in advance of releasing a film in cinemas. They want to know what the counter-programming options are. What else are they going to be up against? You know, they go to see films at markets not just to buy or acquire, they go to see what else is going to be in that period that they're going to be competing with in terms of cinema screens, audience attention, you know, and the campaign. They're not stupid, they know what they're doing. I have a great deal of respect for how hard independent distributors who care about cinema and films, how much hard work they do. Yeah? It's not about their brand, it's not a Netflix or, you know, a Plus or, you know, original. It's about their business of curating content. Yeah? So timing is very important. Sometimes the tools can be very useful because they will tell you what else everyone is doing. They can get the distributors' lists of the Federation of Distributors in your territory, and they can find out what everyone else has booked or penciled, and you can actually do that research very quickly. Audience testing and targeting. This is an interesting one. There's nothing like a live test screening. There is nowhere to hide. Yeah? Nowhere to hide. I did one for Blueberry Inn, a UK comedy that was made last June, May-June, in the UK for 4 million euros. And I insisted when we had some money left over with the producers that we did an NRG test screening in a cinema, a multiplex in Wimbledon for 360 people. And we got NRG to do the focus group interview. Do you know what? NRG still used paper, which people had to fill in. They didn't have screen and tabloids and, you know, a neat kind of system where everyone could just plug in the data. And we did a physical interview with the people, which are called the focus group, which is around 20, 25 people who stayed behind after the screening to find out, as Sam Goldwyn memorably used to ask when people came out of his films, how did you enjoy the film? Yeah, because you've got to remember, if the audience doesn't want to come, nothing will stop them. Yeah? Think about that. What's interesting about the physical conditions of seeing a film and tracking people in terms of audience testing is, yes, it might help if they all had iPads and put in their data instead of the physical ones, but within an hour and a half, we had all the data back from NRG anyway. And my God, it was good. It was brilliant. It was so interesting, so insightful, so helpful. Yeah? But it was a physical, proper audience test screening. And I would say that the film is probably 15% better on the back of that test screening and the results being properly processed by the director and the producers than if we hadn't had that test screening. How do you test screen for a cinema film by plugging it into Gen I tools? You can't yet. We matter, just as you all matter being here in this room together physically with me and us today. It's a shared experience, yeah? Social media campaigns, yes, sure. It can give you budgets and targets and tell you how much time you need to generate and what you need to generate for Insta, etc., and YouTube and blah, blah, blah. There are good marketing people who do that, but they're already able to use quicker tools. So yes, I can see that. Ad campaign spend. All of this is algo driven. Yeah. So we'll talk about that this afternoon. And my big question is, what of curation? The art of humans making choices of what we would like to program, or how we would like people to see things, what we would like people to see things. This is a really interesting balance, which I'll deal with after lunch. What I am saying is there's no shortage of tools, but we still have to use judgment and give weight to what those outputs are. And also stress test them, find out if they haven't hallucinated or gone off onto some other data in input that has skewed the figures. So what's really needed on this value chain map? We should be having AI creative labs. And when I say that, I'm thinking, for example, of a company I went to recently in London called Hat-Trick Entertainment. They are the creme de la creme of comedy. Yeah? They make, have I got news for you? They do a huge amount of worldwide selling and production of comedy shows. Yeah? And when I met their head of Gen AI, a very young guy who's about 28 years old, who had had a lecture I'd given at the National Film School about two years before, hardly out of his nappies. He said, "Oh, it's great to see you, Angus. We're just about to have an AI lab. And we're going to bring together our comedy writers and directors with a group of 5 creative technologists. And we're going to workshop for a week and just play. No pressure. Doesn't matter if no one comes up with anything after a week. But we're going to play with 5 different themes. We'll have probably a flywheel of 5 different ideas for each of the 5 teams. And they're going to play with them for the week. And then we're going to have a pitching session in front of each other, humans all together, of what we think is resonant, worth exploring, how to perhaps use the tools most effectively and where not to use them." Yeah? That is what I call a creative AI lab. Yeah? That's smart. That's open-minded, transparent, and bringing together a range of different types of talent. Yeah? And Hat-Trick have built a suite, an AI suite, where you can go in, and they have about 70 people working for them. They have a number of different independent companies. They're an independent company. They're all owned by ITV or Sky or, what used to be left of Rupert Murdoch. They're independent. And they've got an AI lab, and you can go and play. If you're a writer, director, producer, below or above the line, you can go and play and find out if you've got an idea, or you've got something you want to explore, or you want an effect, or you want to just go in and chat to the creative technologists who run it. You can. I don't see enough of that. That's good. That to me is cool. That's helpful. Okay? Oh, I see I jumped without realizing it. Hold on. So creative AI labs. Why isn't that happening across Europe? A lack of vision. A confused mindset. There's so much going on that we might as well wait and see what happens. And by the way, everything I've just said is mirrored in terms of policy as well. We better wait and see what happens. Yeah? Well, by the time we've waited, it may be too late. Yeah? Regional hubs. I'm a huge fan of regions, of culturally specific places where people speak different. Yeah? We have a lot of them in the UK. We have a country that we've terrorized for hundreds of years called Ireland, which has more creative nous and interesting stories than most things that have come out of the UK, barring Shakespeare. Yeah? Wonderful place to do films, to tell stories, super talented people. Yeah? Regions. Culturally specific stories that have universal value. The heartbeat of the European film industry, if you think about it. Yeah? Not the generic, not the massive genre, not the remakes, the prequels and the sequels, but culturally specific stories that speak to us. Yeah? Regions, absolutely crucial, and therefore not avoiding the new challenge of how to use and adapt to these kinds of tools, but how best to implement them and what to leave behind. Back to the what should, not what can it do. Yeah? We talked about upskilling and training, incredibly important. Not run by OpenAI. Yeah? Let's just be careful here, because self-interest and hubris is alive and very well in the 5 horsemen of the techpocalypse. Yeah. Public funds augmentation, frameworks for responsible AI. There's a chapter which was carefully edited and worked through, and I'm in fact working for FilmUvest at the moment on KPIs and AI to try to work out how public funding in the sector for film, television, screen entertainment, gaming, etc., how it can be put to work in the most sensible, realistic, responsible way. Yeah? The work needs to be done. Clear rules for credits and transparency, not just watermarks, yeah, but proper credits. Very, very important. Copyright rules revisited. And of course, what I mentioned this morning, learning to measure authenticity. There you go. Everything you can imagine is real. Good old Pablo. Yeah, well, a slightly tricky figure in history in terms of attitude to women, but never mind. Let's just think about the imagination. All right, there you go. You're probably all dying for lunch, but is anything that I've said has upset you? Please tell me. Anyone bored? Anyone bored? Go on, you can be honest. You can be transparent. You can watermark me.
Really?
All right. There's one little thing.
As representing the Guild of Directors.
Of directors.
Yes.
Good.
I have to say that I coughed a little bit when you said producers, they invest for 10 years and directors for 1 year maybe.
1 year was a bit short. Producers, I actually said 25 years. Producers, I said 25 years because they look after the long tail of what happens to a film forever, effectively. I totally buy your point that many directors will have worked on a project for at least 5 years. I stand corrected. No problem. Yep, all good. Next. All right, let's have some lunch. I hope you stay, and let's make it work this afternoon, okay? Thank you very much.